We're very pleased to have an exciting lineup tonight and our first talk show of 8, which will be live streamed here on both Facebook and also on the PPMC, which is the Paris Process for Mobility and Climate. PPMC is an initiative which is jointly shared between SlowCAT, which we have a representative of here tonight. That is the Sustainable Partnership on Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, and Michelin's Move On. So we'll hear more about all of that later on tonight. The aim of these talk shows is really to bring what's happening here at COP23, which is a UNFCCC climate change process, out to the broader audience. There's over 20,000 people estimated to be here at the COP in Bonn, Germany, and that's fantastic, and a lot of them are right up to speed at what's happening despite the breadth of what's going on here. But we were hoping to share what's happening here with the broader audience. So especially on transport, clearly, but also some of the linkages to the bigger climate equation. So we have UN Environment representative here and others throughout the week. And so the bigger climate equation is also cross-cutting issues, the Sustainable Development Goals, and other things you'll be hearing about. Before we keep going, I want to take care of some housekeeping issues. So for those of you here, if you don't mind silencing your phones, that's quite important. And if you're interested in asking any questions, you're very welcome to. We have a hashtag #WeAreTransport, hashtag #WeAreTransport. I'm not very good at the social media stuff, but trust me, I think this works. There's people monitoring it. And for those of you in the room, if we have time at the end, we should be able to field questions, and there's a gentleman here, Mark, who will be helping us out with that. So tonight's theme is really the big picture, decarbonizing transportation. So we're hoping to discuss that in its biggest picture in the climate equation, and especially in the UNFCCC context. So our first guests, I'm going to let you introduce yourselves if you don't mind, so that I don't slaughter any names. But we have Zitouni from UN Environment, and you can say a little bit about what you do and what you're here doing at the COP in particular. So just to kick us off.
Thank you, and good evening, everyone. My name is Zitouni Ould Dada. I'm Head of Technology for Sustainable Development at UN Environment, based in Paris. I work in the technology area, which means I work mainly with developing countries to help them to have policies in place, to have access to technology, so they can fight against the impact of climate change, but also address other development issues. And I'm here coordinating UN Environment delegation, because we're supporting countries on a wide range of issues under this agenda of climate change.
Excellent. And I guess we should even start, the UN is the United Nations. Sometimes we get so used to even using acronyms.
That's right.
That we forget. So every year the UN gathers around these COP processes, COP meaning Conference of Parties. All governments in the world gather for the climate equation, and UN Environment has been very critical in figuring out sort of what we call the climate equation. How are we doing to fix the climate, to reduce emissions? You've been producing this GAP report. It's for quite a few years to figure out what are the pathways, what are the projections, how are governments doing to reduce emissions and what have you, and you've just recently released the most recent report. Could you speak a bit about that?
That's right, yeah, with pleasure. Maybe just say something briefly about the context of the COP, and why all these thousands of delegates are here. You've all seen these images on the news about hurricanes and floods and droughts, and the frequency of this is increasing. That means that basically we're heading towards dangerous climate change unless we do something about it. That's why in Paris and at the Paris Agreement, 195 countries or so agreed to do something about it. And that's why we talk about the Paris Agreement. So this Conference of the Parties here in Bonn, the purpose of it is how we're going to do that. And basically all these negotiations, all these deliberations, they're about agreeing on rules, on plans that can actually get us to that objective of keeping the average temperature to below 2 degrees C by the end of the century, and if possible, below even 1.5. So to answer your question more specifically on the GAP report, the United Nations Environment, every year we publish this report to tell the countries and everybody else how we're doing towards meeting that objective of 2 degrees C. And you may have heard of the national contributions that countries come up with. So every country was asked to make contributions. How are they going to meet those 2 degrees C objectives? So the conclusion of the GAP report is that unfortunately we're far from reaching the 2 degrees C objective. If you put all this effort together, what does that mean is that they will take us only to the third of the way. So that means we still have a long way to go, and this is why it's relevant to our talk today, is that every sector has to contribute to filling that gap. Everyone, in fact, it's not just the industry, but everyone is responsible for that, and they have to do their bit. So when we talk about the transport more specifically, perhaps I can give some examples.
That would be great. So currently the national contributions, or the NDCs, are
nationally determined contributions.
Exactly.
I'm just putting it simply as national contributions.
Yes, they're only a third of they would only meet a third of the objective of staying below 2 degree increase.
That's right.
Okay, yeah. And so that gigaton gap, or that emissions gap, does the report compute basically which sectors could contribute most, or what would be the pathways, and where might transportation fit in that, which is currently about 1/4 of all the global emissions?
Perhaps before that, I think since we talk about the gap and gigatons, I don't think everyone is familiar with what the gigaton means. And so just put it in context. If you think about the emissions from the transport sector, including aviation, in the European Union, emissions in a year, that's 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions, right? So just to put it in context, so when you hear a gigaton, that's what it means. So in relation to the sectors, yes, the conclusion from the GAP report, excuse me, is that we need to have significant emission reductions from a wide range of sectors, including energy, agriculture, buildings, transport, agriculture. So all these sectors, you need massive emissions reductions from those. What that means is that you need to invest in new technology in those sectors, and we talk more specifically about transport and what it means. But that's what it means, basically. And if we act on these sectors, and remember, perhaps what I need to say also is that the gap, and I explained what 1 gigaton means.
Yeah, let's hear about the gap.
Yeah, to reach the 2 degrees C, we still have a gap between 11 and 13.5 gigaton. And if we want to meet the 1.5 degrees C, it's between 16 and 19 gigatons. Now, coming back to what I was saying about the actions in these sectors, if we act on them, we will actually reduce emissions by 22 gigatons. So that's more than what we need to get into the 2 degrees C. But we need to do it, and then we need to do it fast. That's the point.
And that's if we act on all of those sectors, we'll have a 22 gigaton reduction.
That's right.
Of all the sectors.
Yes.
So there's sort of a pathway projected for all the sectors to reduce that is actually achievable.
It is.
And I think that's really important to remember.
Exactly. It's still possible, but you have to do it, and you have to do it fast. Because when we talk about 2020 is tomorrow, it's only it's even less than 3 years to go.
Yes.
But 2030 is even, it's
and
not
governments
really
right now are reassessing their NDCs to be delivering them in 2020. And right now at the COP, there are these conversations about the facilitated dialogues. How can they get help from other stakeholders, such as the transport sector, to support them in delivering higher, more ambitious contributions to reduce their emissions. So there's a lot of opportunity here for partners like SlowCAT and others to be supporting governments.
You're absolutely right, because I explained the danger earlier, but there are opportunities in terms of investment, in terms of changing the way we live, we use resources, including on transport, and these are all opportunities. And we have to think about the overall context, not just climate change, because climate change is going to affect every aspect of our lives.
Absolutely.
And then when you consider priorities in other countries in terms of poverty, hunger, security. All these are also important issues. They are affected by climate change in some cases.
Absolutely.
So this is the big picture that we have to think about, and think about the fact that the world we live in is interconnected. It's not like we live in our country and we're protected from these. We're not.
Yeah.
And that's why these negotiations, they're based on international collaboration.
Absolutely.
We have to help each other, and they're based on helping in terms of finance, technology, capacity building, and other issues which allow all of us to face climate change, which is a problem for everyone.
Yeah.
That's basically
the days of one minister working on their own issue alone are over because of that interconnectedness between health and gender and agriculture and forests and land use and transport. Yeah. So every speaker throughout the 2 weeks will be receiving the same question, and I'm going to ask yours before we pivot to our next speaker. And I'm reading it, so I diligent in my accuracy. In your area of work, what is a specific pragmatic action that can transform the transport sector right now, in your view?
I think the transport sector, if we need to transform it, and in relation again to the objective of climate change and sustainable development, we need a revolution. We need a revolution in three things. First of all, we need a revolution in electric cars, because electric cars have to become common, if you like. Everyone has to familiarize themselves with that. And in fact, this is really encouraging, because a number of countries now, including France, India, the UK, have put policies in place that say we're not going to sell any diesel or petrol cars by 2040. And that's an excellent signal to the industry to prepare themselves for the shift, for the revolution.
Provided
so this is the first thing.
Provided they're fueled by renewable energy.
Indeed,
yes.
indeed, This is the first revolution.
Okay.
The second revolution, I would say, is automation of electric cars. And this is again started, as you know, tests are taking place in a number of countries, and that's the future. But the most important thing, I think that's the third revolution I would mention, is we need to think about trip sharing as well. And this is again happening in Canada, in France, in other countries, so that the first two revolutions actually allow us to decarbonize, to reduce emissions, but not to reduce the number of cars on the road and not to reduce the congestion. But the third one allow us to share, allow us to reduce the number of cars, and allow us also to realize that not every one of us has to use a car and for every trip. And I think we really have to be sort of honest about this and be a little bit realistic about it as well, so that if you need to make just 2 kilometers ride, you can walk the distance easily. And
there's a lot of opportunity there as well in increasing access to mobility in rural communities, etc., where there's an informal sector around sharing transportation, but there's maybe some opportunity there. Excellent. You kind of snuck in 3 where I was looking for 1, but I'll let it slide. Okay.
I did say 3.
Yeah, you did. Yeah, you did. You did, but that's okay. All right, you're the first one. So for the rest of you out there coming up, we'll try and stick to 1, but that's all right.
Those were 3 good.
Yeah, they were good. They were good. Okay, so we're going to move now to our next speaker, but please stay with us in case there's some. And if people have questions at the end, you can also line them up for Zitouni. So Talya, thank you so much for joining us. She is the Chief Operating Officer for SlowCAT, as I mentioned before, but maybe you can tell a little bit about why SlowCAT is here, especially, and working with, as I mentioned before, as a partner with Michelin Moving On, with PPMC, et cetera, Paris Process for Mobility and Climate. Why here, why now? We mentioned transport is 25% of emissions, but maybe you can explain a little bit more about the need for you to be here.
It's actually, we start with the 25% of the emissions. We are the 25% emissions as the transport sector. But back in 2007, when our team was at COP, like Corny Hozianga, who is currently our Secretary General, lately Shipper, and other transport people, they were looking around and realizing there were no transport events at COP. Transport was not in the room. So we were contributing to the emissions, but we weren't contributing to the solutions. So they brought together a number of stakeholders and said, how can transport be part of the solution?
Excellent.
And that was the idea of SlowCAT, a partnership, a multi-stakeholder partnership on sustainable low-carbon transport That is, we have more than 90 members, the multilateral development banks, the transport operators, civil society, research institutions, UN institutions. So if we bring everybody together, can we create the solution? And that's how SlowCAT started in 2009. And as we were doing this, our mission is to promote the integration of sustainable and low-carbon transport in global policies on both sustainable development and climate change. And now that we have the global policies, the SDGs and the climate change Paris Agreement, we have modified that mission to say now we need to leverage action on the implementation of these policies. Make sure transport is part of the action, not just at the policy level.
Yeah, and there's a lot of, this is a lot of points you're making, and I want to make it a little bit more practical for people who are not familiar with the transport space. So you mentioned a very practical way of looking at solving the transportation dilemma is the acronym AVOID, Shift and Improve. Can you maybe explain a little bit about that tactical approach to sustainable transportation?
Avoid is avoid unnecessary trips. It doesn't mean if you're in the rural areas, don't get to the markets. Please do. That's part of the access. But if you're in a place where you were just saying, if you're in a case where you do not need to take the trip, please avoid it. If you need to take the trip, please shift to more efficient and sustainable and safer ways of transport. And if you cannot do that, at least improve the way you're using your cars or your vehicles. Electric mobility and clean fuels is part of the improved equation, but it's also important to make sure we shift to the right modes and avoid the unnecessary trips.
So a very concrete example of that, which you might mention, is avoid. If you can't fly to Geneva and you can telecommute instead, do that. And then the next one.
If you can fly to Geneva, yes, do telecommute for a UN meeting if you can possibly do that.
Right.
If you're trying to come here from the Bula zone or Bonn zone, please walk. That's the shift part instead of taking the bus. And if you do want to take the bus, then take the e-bus that the COP is providing, and that's the improvement we have at COP.
Avoid, shift, improve.
Avoid, shift, and improve.
So it's really to do the lowest, every decision you make, try and make the least amount of emissions possible, basically, through avoiding, shifting, and improving your decisions.
The solutions are there. You were talking about 2020. There are a lot of quick win actions, as we call them, solutions that are proven that can work, that can be done by 2020 in 3 years. If it's just scaled up, it would help the 2020 goals. And we also have a macro roadmap, a global vision, an actionable vision on decarbonizing transport. Currently, if the business as usual happens, transport will be emitting 13 gigatons. But there are ways to cut it down to 6 and 7, and there are even ways to cut it down to 2 and 3. Just like in the UNEP report, there are solutions that can bring us well below 2 degrees in the transport sector, like other sectors. We just need to act on them. And the governments and cities and companies and the civil society needs to work together for this to happen.
Absolutely. Would you like to maybe speak of a good example of some of the solutions that your partners are working on, or maybe just explain a little bit more about the breadth of all the partners that are part of your initiatives?
For the quick win actions, there are shared mobility, integrated transport. So it is in different fields. It's cycling as part of the solutions. Bike sharing in China has changed the way things work. Through the bike shares in Guangzhou, the pollution levels have come down, accidents have come down. So it's part of the sustainable development, sustainable lifestyle, but it's also part of emissions coming down. This is something very small, but most of the SlowCAT colleagues who used to take the cars and the taxis, even in our offices, now cycle to work or walk to work. This is just one example. There are a lot of things happening here at DHL. DHL is championing, and I'm sure Björn will talk about it in the coming minutes, zero emissions targets. So if a freight sector can do it, if cycling can do it, if buses, not just cars becoming EVs, but if buses can become electric buses, so 50 people moving together is emitting less, and if this is just scaled up, it will not only help the climate dilemma, but it will also make sure people are going from point A to Z in a safe way, accessible way, and they're affordable. So it will actually make sure important trips are continuing. People are getting to school and work and healthcare, but are just doing it in a way that doesn't create a problem for the environment or for their own health by creating more pollution.
Absolutely. I think it's really important for us to remember that transportation is both, it's about people moving, but it's also about goods moving. And then it's about infrastructure, but it's also personal choice. There's, you can only blame the infrastructure so long when at some point it's about what we all choose to do with our day-to-day opportunities to move, what we purchase, how we purchase it, and move it, and also what we do with our own.
So people usually say, how can I be part of the solution by myself? The first thing is make your individual choices. The second thing is talk about it. Talk about why you're taking the bus or the cycling, or talk to people that you're doing this and this can change. Give good examples so that people are motivated. We were speaking about it with our team that it takes one person to say something negative for people to go down and just lose hope in things. But it takes all of us to make sure the hope continues, the movement continues, the good solutions are there, and if they're shared, it will just create work. And this is why actually we work together with Michelin, and we said SlowCAT is bringing the civil society and the transport from global multilateral development bank development part, but we also need the private sector together. And we united our forces in 2015 when the SDGs and the Climate Paris Agreement was happening and created the Paris process on mobility and climate. So we now have more than 200 organizations working together for a decarbonized transport system.
Absolutely, and you've been doing excellent work here, and I'm sure it will continue supporting the parties. I was going to say member states, but parties to the COP to deliver on their NDCs. I'm hoping that they scale up their ambition. Hoping. We're all hoping. Excellent. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think we want to transition to hear one of these really good practices from our representative from the DHL, which is known globally, but Deutsche Post. So I want to thank you both very much, and please stick around. So if there's questions directed at you at the end, we are able to. Wait, I didn't ask you your question. Are you ready?
The answers.
Oh, you did. I'm going to ask you anyway. In your area of work, Talya, what is a specific pragmatic action that can transition the transport sector right now? You only get one.
Make a conscious choice on how you're taking a trip.
Individuals.
Individuals, company, because we're all part of different networks. Do it individually, do it together with your family, do it with your company, and then go bigger. In your city, make a conscious choice to make sure you're taking a sustainable low-carbon transport solution.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great. So yes, you can leave your microphones here, and we're going to have our next speaker come on up. It'll be Björn. I'm going to say it correctly, Hannappel, the head of Responsibility Strategy and Standards at Deutsche Post DHL Group. Thank you so much. And maybe we can have a fresh glass of water for you. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks for joining us. So I understand. Thank you so much for also hosting us here at this beautiful venue. And we understand that you that your company basically has launched a decarbonization plan for 2050, which is quite ambitious. And congratulations on that. But maybe you can spell a little bit about that plan. What is the goal besides this big overarching one? Are there any milestones on the way? And what was the vision behind it?
Yeah, sure. So the company, as you said, has set itself the target to decarbonize by 2050, to reduce all logistics-related emissions to zero. Actually, that's the broader vision. We thought we need to be bold to achieve the 2 degrees or the 1.5 degrees target, and to be responsible for what we can do to achieve that. But at the same time, we said, okay, that's so long to go until 2050. We also need more concrete short-term targets or mid-term targets. So for example, we decided to have a 50% carbon efficiency increase until 2025 compared to 2007, which means that for every shipment, for every parcel that we deliver, we want to burn 50% less fuel than in 2007 until 2025. Or a second target is the so-called local target, where we say we want to deliver the first and last mile with 70% of the first and last mile with clean solutions, for example bicycles, but also electric vehicles. And all of you who entered the Post Tower, you walked just by. There's a little exhibition down there on the bicycles, on the cargo bikes that we have, but also on our street scooter, which is a full electric vehicle that we've produced ourselves, because we were not able to find someone selling this to us, what we need. So these are parts of the target that we have, and we will review these targets every 5 years to get closer to the zero emissions in 2050.
Now, did you say 50% increase in efficiency? Did you say 50% increase in efficiency by 2020 or by 2025?
2025.
Okay, so that's still pretty ambitious.
Yeah.
And that's through using these electric vehicles, and maybe is it primarily through using electric vehicles and the bike in the last mile, or and you feel very confident that this is achievable?
Yeah.
That is ambitious, and
Yeah.
I congratulate you on it. You should be ambitious. We need it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah.
And yeah, we think it's ambitious. I think, but we also think that until 2025 we can make the targets. But I would also like to share with you, because I think it's very interesting, also maybe for other companies, that for the 2050 vision, roughly 2/3 of that we know quite well how we will achieve it. We will also be depending on the development of technologies and availability of, for example, sustainable biofuels and things like that. But still, for 1/3 of that zero target, we don't know yet how we will do it.
Yeah.
But what we figured out is that it's very important to have a bold target, to have a bold statement, because this is the only way to change the mindset, also within our company, but also externally, because no one can hide away from the target anymore, because 100% is 100%. So the question is not if you have to contribute to it, the only question is how to contribute to it.
Good.
And this was one of the main themes that we had developing the new strategy, and now we already see that there's a shift in the mindset in the company here, because people start thinking about, okay, I always thought I can't do anything. Now I have to think, how can I achieve it? And that's a difference.
I'm a little curious about how maybe your employee reviews are dependent on this, but we can go offline and talk about that. So I hope they are actually dependent on that. How are you working with your consumers and other partners to deliver on this?
So we have also a target especially for our customers, which says that we want to incorporate in more than 50% of our sales, we want to incorporate green solutions. So immediately our customers will benefit from that. And at the same time, we're driving our sales force and our operations also to think of how they can, what they can do to make the supply chain of our customers more efficient. And also, since already 2008, we have carbon neutral products that customers can buy. So standard products like parcels and letters, and where we do the offset. But also we have customized logistic solutions, where then we're also working together, of course, with our subcontractors. And that ranges from very generic, you have to sign our supplier code of conduct, where it says you have to support us in our ambition, but that's very generic only. But it goes down to joint projects that we're doing with our subcontractors, where we're sharing the investment costs, for example, and also then sharing again the benefits and the cost savings that we have. And a few examples are, for example, LNG trucks that we're operating, or that subcontractors operate on our behalf in Europe for bigger customers, or cargo bikes that also not only we use them, but also our subcontractors are using them in Italy, Germany, Netherlands, other countries. And for example, the e-commerce sector is booming right now quite heavily, especially in Asia Pacific, and in Vietnam, for example, we're using electro-scooter for our subcontractors. So our subcontractors using electric scooters to do the last mile delivery in Vietnam, for example. So that's the collaboration.
And how are you sort of gathering all of this data and making sure that you're actually holding yourselves or being held to account for this? How is that? I mean, that must be pretty tough because you are a global entity. And
it was tough in the beginning, but I mean, it's already our second strategy, so to say.
Okay.
We started already back in 2008, where we had our first Go Green strategy, which was 30% more carbon efficient by 2020. We achieved that already 2016, and we recognized already early so that we need to do something else. And how we recognized it is that we have built an internal in-house carbon accounting and controlling system. We were looking for solutions and then found out, okay, the only organization within our organization that reaches out to everywhere is the finance organization. So we're not only counting euros now or revenue,
carbon units,
but we're also counting liters of diesel, liters of kerosene, or kilowatt hours now, and this is all going through the finance system, so we have a very good overview on a monthly basis on the fuel consumption or the energy consumption in general.
Excellent. Okay, great. Yeah. And if you had, I'm going to get to that last question, so you don't, you're not off the hook. But if you had sort of a message, or it could be lessons learned, avoid this, don't do that, or do this, or any sort of message to other service providers in this industry, do you have any words of wisdom?
I mean, we were the first logistics provider to have such a target back in 2008, and today there's hardly anyone in the logistics industry without it, so that's great, I think. And we also hope now that we will set an example and be the leader, but others will follow. So my advice would be bold and be brave, actually. Be ambitious, because that's the only way how we can achieve it. We need to have ambitious targets, even if we don't know yet how we will achieve them, because only if we have them, we will start thinking about how to achieve it, and then we will have a chance to really get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Very good point. Okay, so now for the quintessential question, and try to stick to one.
Yeah, I mean, I had a bit of time to think about that already.
So you
now.
don't even need me to ask it. You've got it.
So I think from my perspective, it would be the electrification of the last mile delivery at same or maybe even lower cost than with a conventional vehicle. And the second part of the sentence is very important because I mean, there's a lot of things that companies do, others do, are pilots or testing vehicles, and then others need to fund them because it's not a business case. But I think what we need is a business case, and then companies like us will do it, and then it's
the last mile specifically.
Yeah.
But
I mean
but
that's
delivering the last mile.
I mean that's something that we can do already right now, and that also more could do. And then there's more challenges ahead, I think, if talking about aviation and ocean freight. But if you're asking what can we do concretely right now, then it would be the electrification of the last mile.
Excellent. I think there's a lot of momentum around that. That's good to hear. I think that is something we could be doing right now. And thankfully, with all these political commitments around it, I think we're going to be seeing that around the corner. So excellent. Thank you. Are you okay staying while we invite up the next guest? Come on up. If you don't mind grabbing a seat right here. So we have now Daniel Bongardt. Yes. Great, thank you so much. A senior advisor for the German German Development Agency, GIZ. While he gets his microphone, thank you, Steve, gets his microphone set. Excellent. So you wear a few different hats, as I understand it here, but maybe you want to first just to let us know sort of what are you doing here at the COP, and tell us a little bit about what your role is. And it's okay if it's a few different things.
Yes. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think it's very interesting to have the COP here in Bonn. GIZ is based here, so I just work a couple of minutes from here. And the world's coming to the place. Our original job at GIZ is we work with governments, partner governments from the German government, the German Ministry of Environment and the German Ministry of Development Cooperation. We work with them on solutions in the transport sector. And we have seen a massive shift in the past, when in the 80s and 90s we worked on infrastructure. Now we work on transport and climate change, how to reduce emissions, how to reduce environmental problems. And so that's why the COP is so important, because it's the framework for governments to set up plans. And so we have seen now these national contributions, the climate plans, be submitted before Paris, and we see the gap that my previous speaker already described here, and we also see that in transport. We also saw in transport that, for example, in the EU, it was the only sector which didn't manage to reduce its emissions since 1990, while many other sectors have already contributed to this. And now
the EU transport sector didn't
yes,
reduce.
the EU transport
The EU
sector
transport sector hasn't reduced since 1990.
No.
Yes. Okay. Just to be clear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so there's an urgent need now. And I think the interesting thing is that since Paris, transport has gained momentum somehow. So because now people are realizing if we really want to decarbonize, achieve this 2-degree, 1.5-degree target, it's not longer possible to not act in transport. And we see initiatives like the one from DHL. We see also countries coming up with mitigation actions, how to reduce emissions. And we see it not only in Europe, in the US or the G20 countries, but we also see it in developing countries. So they see there's also a benefit in having better transport systems, and there's a benefit also for the climate change. So we need to develop in line with the Paris Agreement.
So I'm going to ask you a bit of a hard question possibly, and we didn't talk about this in advance, but so as you know, I think there's 160 countries that have submitted roughly their development plans for the national contributions, the NDCs, and a handful of those have actually targeted transportation targets for reducing their transportation emissions. Maybe I think it's roughly 70 or so have mentioned transportation, but only a handful of them, I think it's something like 6% or so, have actually plans for transportation. So what do you think is the blockage there? Even though it has raised in profile, it's a quarter of the emissions. We have leaders in the field who are saying, we get it, we're working on it, et cetera. What is the disconnect, and why has G20, so many of the European states sort of plateaued in their emission reductions? It seems like while the attention here is definitely increasing, there's some lack of traction. What is that, and how can we overcome it?
Yeah, I think
it's complicated, I'm sure.
Yeah, I think many countries have something, and they are planning actions, and they are aware of the problem. So you mentioned the national contribution. So we see when we have analyzed all these submissions to the Paris Agreement that more than 80% of the countries have mentioned the transport sector as an important area. So we still see that some specific actions in about 105 of the 160, we have listed some kind of mitigation action. But we don't have really targets.
Right.
For example, in the G20, only Japan has communicated a transport sector target of, I think, 27% until 2030. Compared to 2010, I think. So, but the others don't have that. But we also have to admit that, so before Paris, nobody knows what the others were doing. And now we see all the examples, and we have the 5-year cycle in the Paris Agreement that every 5 years countries will revise their targets. And I think that's also why there's now so much interest in the sector to really learn from others. And we saw already just after Paris, for example, Germany has set up their Climate Action Plan 2050, a pathway how to decarbonize. And there they have communicated a target for the transport sector as well. So that is 40 to 42% until 2030. And France has communicated a target for also for the transport sector, 70% until 2050. So I think there's dynamics in that. And so within the next NDCs, I'm very optimistic that we will see more here. And we will maybe also see more private sector companies to come up with targets on this. But however, so targets are nice, yeah? In the end, what matters is that we have the actions on the ground, and we really need to move into implementation, and we need to start somewhere.
Absolutely. That's a very good point. And I know that your GIZ does a lot of support for really great concrete projects out in the field. Before we move to this question that came from the ether, the Twitter sphere, and before I ask you your question about what would you like to see as a concrete pragmatic solution, do you want to speak to maybe a really great example of sort of that implementation solutions that are out there on the ground that are successful right now? Do you have anything you want to mention about that, or do you feel like you might be pitching one program above another if you do so?
Yeah. So I think there are many initiatives out there. For example, fuel economy of vehicles is very important. So many countries have set up, and we just have analyzed recently the G20 countries, fuel economy standards to ask the car manufacturers and the vehicle manufacturers to really comply with the highest efficiency possible. So we have seen them emerging, and we have seen them improving. What's really missing there, and I think tomorrow also the EU will publish new fuel economy standards, so everybody's curious about that. But what's still missing there in that area is on the freight sector. For the fuel economy, there are too few fuel economy standards for trucks. It's really a gap still. Heavy-duty vehicles, it's still a gap in that area. And I have lived for a couple of years in China, and that was fascinating to see how they do their electric mobility policies. And I think China and this example of electric vehicles is really also an example that we need international cooperation in that sphere, because the vehicle markets, they are interconnected. If China, with a huge market for vehicles, is pushing towards electric mobility, that would mean that this technology pathway is very relevant for others. The German car manufacturers now have to provide vehicles to the Chinese market, electric vehicles, if they still want to be able to sell them there. So this technology, other markets will benefit from.
Absolutely.
And so that's, from my perspective, why it's so important also to look at the international aspects here.
And there are some countries that only import cars, as you're alluding to, that don't have any efficiency standards for what they import. I mean, the burden is on the producers of cars to actually always be producing at a certain efficiency level, heavy-duty vehicles, passenger vehicles, etc. We won't mention names of any countries, but absolutely, there's a lot that can be done there for fuel efficiency on all size vehicles. Before we go to the Twitters, do you want to, let's ask the question, and because we're going to capture these for social media later. In your area of work, what is the specific pragmatic action that can transform the transport sector now? You only get one.
So I had the time to think about it before, because the others has to answer. I select one very specific action, because I think we need more advocates for that, and it's parking management. Parking management is the least sexy transport policy, I think, that is available. Nobody really wants to talk about parking management. People don't like to pay for parking management, but I think, and that's the experiences we had in Shenzhen in China that showed, it's one of the key things. We not only have to provide the alternatives, we also have to set a framework for cars. And I think that's something that is ready to implement. Cities have it, just copy and paste.
That's quite interesting. Coming from New York City, I think you're onto something. Excellent. Yeah, good. And my wheels are spinning as far as possible solutions there. Okay. This question came from Twitter. How can we foster the mobilization of climate finance to enable quick action on transport? That might be tough. If you have any ideas on that, you're welcome to chime in. Do you have any thoughts on that, about how to mobilize climate finance? Maybe they're referring to the different finance mechanisms, I don't know, the Green Climate Fund, maybe CDM, maybe just general leveraging private finance, I'm not sure.
So I think until now the Green Climate Fund does not have a transport project yet.
You're right.
So hopefully in the future that changes. I think in the transport sector, billions are invested from national budgets. So we need climate finance to trigger, to change some of these national budgets. And so there we need better project proposals. We need a lot of capacity building to actually bring that climate finance into the sector and change with a little bit of money, the big money.
Yeah, the development banks have been delivering in large sums, but you're mentioning that others could be bringing it in as well. Okay. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would like to add that what I said before. So there's a few things that are missing that we can't do today as a company because it's just not economically viable to do them. And I think here I see a gap from governments or authorities to fill that really and to develop certain technologies further so that it's a business case at the end and that will foster then really the implementation at the end. I mean, we were lucky for ourselves because we managed to produce and to develop an own electric vehicle that we can operate at the same cost like a diesel, or maybe in the future even cheaper than a diesel. And that, of course, if you think of it from an environmental perspective, it's great, but you can also think of it from a just purely business perspective. And this is what will transform the sector, I think, because the companies, although we might be dreaming of that, they won't do it just for the climate, but if there's a business case for them behind it, then they will do it. And I think the financing would be needed for these parts of technologies and solutions that are not yet there at a reasonable cost.
You're both very much building the case for sort of the interconnectivity of transportation with the finance, with urban planning, with cross-ministerial planning, horizontal between cities, regionals, national level, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of depth to the conversation we've had that shows that this is, of course, not just a singular little space that needs to work in isolation. It needs to be cross-sectoral, of course, which we all know and we've known for a long time, but it just continues to be brought out through these conversations. So I want to thank you both. I think we're going to be wrapping up today's conversation unless there's other questions from the audience. Let's have one. Yeah, we do have one question. Great. I'm not sure if you're caught on camera or not, so.
I'll stand in case I am.
Okay, great.
Thank you. My name is James Beard from WWF, in case the T-shirt didn't give that away. Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. I wanted to pick up on the theme of sustainable transport in developing countries, and specifically the leapfrog effect. So in several sectors such as telecommunications and energy, we've seen that we can leapfrog undesirable slow technologies such as instead of the landline go straight to the mobile phone, and instead of energy access through fossil fuels we can do it through renewable technology. Do you think that it's possible to promote access to transport in the developing world whilst leapfrogging private ownership of petrol and diesel cars and going straight to more cycling, more public transport, more electric vehicles? Thank you.
That's a great question, and I'll repeat it just very quickly in case anyone couldn't hear it, but could everyone hear it? Yes, repeat? Okay, so that was from WWF. He had a panda T-shirt for those who couldn't see it, and he was asking whether or not and Zitouni, do you want to join us up here actually from UN Environment to help field these questions? He was asking whether or not the leapfrog or philosophy of leapfrogging technology in development, similar to the mobile technology phenomenon where people skipped landlines and went from having no mobile technology or phones to to going straight to having mobile technology for phones. Could that be applied as well to transportation in some way, possibly with sharing or with sustainable transportation? I have my views on that, but let's go to the panelists. Should we start here?
I can start. I mean,
and especially with freight, actually, this could be interesting with freight in particular.
Yeah. I mean, yes, we want to do this. There's several challenges. The biggest challenge, I mean, one of the challenges is that in least developed countries, our fleet is so small and our footprint is relatively small that it's difficult to implement something. But if we look at maybe countries in Asia that are developing now faster, yes, we're trying to introduce, for example, bikes again. So, I mean, in Asia there were a lot of bikes in the past. They are all gone, more or less, and we're not bringing back cargo bikes into the cities in Singapore, for example, but also in other cities in less developed countries. But we're also trying to introduce electric mobility there. The challenge is that, I mean, you can get a car or a truck, but you can't get the maintenance, and sometimes you can't get renewable energy to charge the truck. And for us, electric mobility is always including renewable energy to charge it, because otherwise it's a bit, okay, we don't want to do that. So, the infrastructure is not ready. The surrounding is not ready for us. That's why we're also thinking of going into these countries with our own electric vehicle, already thinking of how to expand that to other regions of the world, not only using them in Europe, but also in China or for the whole of Asia, and to develop our own infrastructure. But this will take time, actually. And I think here, again, this would be a good message to financing authorities or whatever to support this and setting up the infrastructure so that that we are able to operate there.
Good point. And I want to admit that I was looking for the Talya, but I couldn't find her, so I didn't mean to have an all-male panel up here for this moment. But again, there you are. If you want to, we'll swap out.
Yeah.
Do you want to? Do you have thoughts on this?
Yes, I think it's an excellent question. And so I think when you look at cities, there's not so much different, because in cities everywhere in the world, there are smart young people who think about new solutions. And if you look on the mobile phones, the apps for sharing, transportation and so on, so sometimes even innovations pop up in those cities that we don't have yet here, and it's maybe much more difficult to implement here in Germany because we have a very strict regulatory framework, but there's much more possibility for testing there. And I think there will be plenty of solutions seen. We just have had a guest from Cairo, Egypt. She's providing, with a small company, a ride-sharing service for people commuting together into the city. So there's a specific solution for the challenge to have so many different groups. I mean, maybe you don't want to share your car with someone you don't know, to partner with companies and ask larger companies to motivate the people to ride share, and then you will always get a shared ride with your colleague. I think there was very smart solutions, and that was maybe not thought about here yet. And from my perspective, this is some kind of leapfrogging that goes maybe beyond technology. In the technology sphere, maybe it's like electric motorbikes. That's an option, and I know that UN Environment is working on that. So.
Excellent.
I don't.
Yeah. It's interesting because the question is, what are we leapfrogging? In mobile technology, we're leapfrogging this huge infrastructure of the landlines, et cetera, and that's what we're leapfrogging, is sort of the cumbersome nature of the mobile landline and getting straight to the agile, small cellular phone. But in transportation, the question sort of is, what are we leapfrogging over to provide the service of transportation that's more sustainable? So to me, that's sort of the conundrum. Yeah.
Just to add to that, yes, we want to leapfrog. We want countries to leapfrog. But you need certain things to happen to enable that. It's like if you want to construct a house, you can't just start by ordering, the windows and doors and doing electricity. You need some foundation. You need something that the house can sit on. was the same if you want to leapfrog in transport, you need some infrastructure. You need roads, you need codes, you need a number of things that can allow that leapfrogging to happen. And that's related to the previous question on investment, on finance, climate finance, which is also to do with the fact that finance can come when there are conditions there that can allow the financing to happen. And I gave the example earlier about countries like France, the UK, India, who said we won't sell any petrol or diesel car by 2040. That's a policy signal for the long term that allow investment to happen in electric cars. So it's this kind of policies long term that can give some confidence to people and entrepreneurs in particular to invest. So the leapfrogging, the investments need to happen when there is a foundation there that can stand on solidly, and that has happened with a number of countries.
That's a good point. I think there does need to be some sort of like rules, some basics there, including just safe roads, for example. And there's some organizations that are really working on just getting the basics there, so that the foundation is there. Talya, do you want to join and grab a microphone and say anything there before we wrap up? Yeah, we've got a handheld mic. You can. So leapfrogging. Oh, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Thank you. Have a seat. And this will be your last comment anyway, and then we're going to wrap up. So yeah, so leapfrogging. What do you see as sort of the future of leapfrogging in the sustainable transport world? Is it possible? What is needed?
We need to transform the way we're thinking about the whole thing. I think if we need to leap and we need to go forward, and one of the things we're trying to do is to create a political leadership around this whole issue, and do that with champions of companies and countries and cities to decarbonize. So we need a paradigm shift. We can't keep doing the things we're doing and expect that miraculously transport will decarbonize or will reach the gap that UNEP is talking about. We do need to change the way we do things, change the way we envision transport, and maybe in the developing world, that was one of the questions, the youth should not be dreaming when they're 18 they're going to have a car, but they should be dreaming of a society where the public transport is cool enough to take. And I always give at a very individual level. My brother works in Istanbul for a multilateral organization, a corporation, and he used to love his car the company gave. But then the BRT system in Istanbul came, and instead of getting stuck in the traffic for an hour, in 18 minutes, he can now get to the other side, from the Asian side of Istanbul to the European side. And now you see a lot of corporate people, young people, actually taking the bus rapid transport because it's convenient and it's cool, and it's not like, oh, public transport, you're taking it. It's actually, yeah, a good idea. So I think if we just do the paradigm shift of cycling is cool, public transport is cool, we can do it. If the Queen of Netherlands or the Prince of Netherlands is cycling, then you and me and everybody can do it. I think that's how we'll do the leapfrogging.
Excellent, great. Sector. Thanks so much. And if you can't cycle, at least you can get on public transport. Not everyone, but excellent point. No, very, very good point. And there's, in many cities, they're talking about youth are actually not getting the driver's license because they're finding public transport to be so convenient. So maybe there's hope there. Excellent. So I really want to thank the excellent guests we've had. So from Deutsche Post DHL Group, and from UN Environment, from SlowCAT, and from GIZ. Thank you so much. This talk show is the first of 8, which we'll be having, and just for this week, I had the themes, the upcoming themes. Tomorrow, we will be talking about sustainable mobility for all. On Thursday, the 9th, we'll be talking about financing for transport. And on Friday, we'll be talking about e-mobility and innovation. So that's just for this week, and then next week we have more, which you can find on the Facebook and on PPMC website, and I'm sure other places that I'm not quite sure all of the places will be posted. But please do stay in touch on the chat, the chat site if you have questions. If you have questions that we weren't able to get to tonight, we'll try and answer them in the future, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks.